Welcome to the introduction to Masechet Nazir. Masechet Nazir continues Masechet Nedarim to a large extent because Nazirut is a vow that a person takes. And so we'll see many similarities between the discussions in Masechet Nedarim and the discussions in Masechet Nazir, starting with the very first chapter where Masechet Nedarim begins by discussing Kol Kinuyei Nedarim Ki Nedarim, and Masechet Nazir begins by saying Kol Kinuyei Nazirut Ki Nazirut. Now, we know that one of the unique things about Masechet Nedarim was to try and understand what was the rabbis' approach towards Nedarim. Did they see this as a positive phenomenon or as a negative phenomenon? And in general, I think that we can say that the rabbis did not like vows. They saw them as a problem, as an obstacle that needs to be solved. However, towards Nazirut, the rabbis have a more complex relationship. First of all, we know, and this is quite unique in terms of rabbinic masechtot and how much we know about their backdrop in the Second Temple period. We know that during the Second Temple period, there were indeed many Nazirim, and this was a very common phenomenon. The Mishnah itself describes a few instances of well-known Nazirim. For instance, in the third chapter, Ma'aseh Beheleni HaMalka Shehalach Bna LaMilchama, a story of Heleni the queen, whose son went to war. Ve'amra im yavo bni min hamilchama b'shalom ehe nazira 7 shanim. She said, if my son will return from battle in peace, I will become Nazira for 7 years. And indeed, ba bna min hamilchama ve'ayta nazira 7 shanim. Indeed, her son returned safely, and she became a Nazirite for 7 years. Many other sources, such as Josephus, Philo, the Gospels, tell us many instances of different Nazirites who were walking around the streets of Jerusalem during the Second Temple period and bringing the sacrifice that a Nazir must bring at the end of the ceremony, at the end of the period of the Naziriteship. Josephus relays, for instance, a woman named Berniki visited in Jerusalem in order to repay her vow to God. And then he goes on to say that it is very common, this is the custom, that anyone who is suffering from an illness or from another difficulty or travails will take a vow that for 30 days before they mean to bring their sacrifices, they will refrain from drinking wine or from shaving their head. So what's interesting about the way that Josephus describes the Naziriteship is that he says that the people take a vow to bring a sacrifice at the end of the period of the Naziriteship, and the sacrifice is actually in order to give thanks for being rescued from an illness or from another travail. And what's customary is that before they bring their sacrifice, they also refrain from drinking wine or from shaving their hair for 30 days. So that raises the question, what exactly is the focus of the Naziriteship? And when we look at the verses in the Torah, the situation actually becomes less clear and more complex to understand what is the focus of the Naziriteship. Almost all of chapter 6 in Sefer Bamidbar discusses the Nazirites' vows and the ceremony at the conclusion of the vows. So chapter 6 begins by describing in verses 1 through 8, describing the vows of the Nazir And we see here that there's actually three different emphases on what the Nazir must refrain from doing. First of all, the Nazir has to refrain from drinking wine. So, miyain v'shechar yazir, chometz yain v'chometz shechar lo yishteh. The Nazir has to refrain from drinking wine and also from eating or partaking of anything that is derived from grapes. The second part in verse 5, Kol yemei neder nizro ta'ar lo ya'avor al rosho. All of the days of the Naziriteship, he has to refrain from a razor going over his head. Ad mlot hayamim asher yazir laHashem, kadosh yeh gadel pera se'ar rosho. So he has to grow his hair for all of the period of the Naziriteship. And the third part, Kol yemei haziro laHashem al nefesh met lo yavo. All of the period of the Naziriteship, he has to be careful not to become impure to the dead. So we might think that what a Nazir has to do is he has to refrain from all three of these prohibitions. However, what we'll see during the Masechet is that the rabbis actually seem to suggest at many different points in the Masechet that perhaps not all three parts of the Nazirite vow have equal weight. Perhaps the core of being a Nazir is not drinking wine, or perhaps the core is not shaving one's head, or perhaps the core is not becoming impure to the dead. So we'll see how different parts of the Masechet will pull in different directions, trying to identify what exactly is the core of the Nazirut. However, the continuation of the Psukim complicate matters even more, because when the Psukim describe the ceremony at the conclusion of the Nazirut, they say very explicitly in verse 13, V'zot Torat HaNazir. These are the laws of the Nazir. And the same expression appears also at the conclusion of this section in verse 21, Zot Torat HaNazir. So it seems that perhaps everything that came before, all the three parts of the vow that the Nazir takes, maybe that's actually not the core of the Nazirut at all, but those are only practices that precede the core of the Nazirut. And the core of the Nazirut is what comes at the end of the Nazirite's vow. When the Nazir comes to the Mikdash and shaves his head and brings korbanot. And the Nazir has to bring three offerings, in fact. Philo actually calls Nazirut Haneder Hagadol, the great vow, because the Nazir has to bring so many different sacrifices. He has to bring a chatat, a sin offering, an olah, an elevation offering, and shlamim, a peace offering. And not only that, but in verse 18, the verse says, "V'gilach hanazir petach oel moed et rosh nizro." The Nazir has to shave off his hair. "V'lakach et se'ar rosh nizro v'natan al ha'esh asher tachat zevach hashlamim." He takes his hair and he puts it on the fire. So that's actually another sacrifice that the Nazir brings, which would strengthen the view that perhaps this is the core of the Nazirut. The core of the Nazirut is growing one's hair and then bringing it as a sacrifice to God. On the other hand, in verse 20, once the Nazir is finished with this whole ceremony, the Pasuk says, "Ve'achar yishteh hanazir yain." So perhaps that's the core of the Nazirut, that during the Nazirut you refrain from drinking wine, and when you're finished, then you're allowed to continue to drink wine. So it's very, very unclear from the Psukim what is the focal point of the Nazirut. And we'll see throughout the Masechet how different parts of the Masechet will focus on different parts of these Psukim and will pull in different directions. So one part of the Masechet is going to focus very strongly on the three prohibitions of the Nazir. Another part of the Masechet is going to focus very strongly on the Isur Tum'ah, and we'll have many sugiyot that are going to discuss Tum'at Met. And actually, it seems, we know that there is no Yerushalmi and no Bavli on the Masechtot of the Mishnah that deal with death impurity. And it seems that perhaps some of the sugiyot that deal with this question have ended up in Masechet Nazir. And finally, a very big part of the Masechet will also deal with korbanot. And as the Tosfot open the Masechet and they say that this Masechet actually shouldn't have been in Seder Nashim at all, but should have been in Masechet, in Seder Kodshim, because it deals so extensively with korbanot. The question of how Chachamim saw the Nazir remains an important question. And we see already from the earliest sources two differing approaches. In the Sifri Bamidbar, the Sifri focuses on the pasuk v'chiper alav me'asher chata ala nefesh. So the Nazir is actually atoning for a sin. What is the sin? Asks Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. V'chi al eizo nefesh chata zeh shetzarich kapara. What was his sin that he needs to bring atonement? Al shetzi'er nafsho min hayayin. The sin is that he prohibited himself from wine, abstained from wine. And what's the problem with abstaining from wine? It seems that in general, Rabbi Elazar HaKapar has a negative view of becoming an ascetic and refraining from enjoying and taking pleasure in the world. And he sees the Nazir as paradigmatic of a person like that who is trying to become holy and sacred through abstention. And therefore, he sees this as a negative thing. On the other hand, in the Sifri Zuta focuses on the pasuk, Kol Yemei Nizro Kadosh Hu LaHashem. He is sacred to Hashem, the Nazir. Why? Mipnei shenazar derech prishut v'tahara nikra kadosh. Someone who took this vow of abstention and of purity is actually called a kadosh. V'lo od ela sheshkalo hakatuv kenavi. He's even considered to be like a prophet, as the verse from Amos says, "V'akimi b'nechem leneviim u'mibechorchem lenezirim." So there's a parallel that's drawn between prophets and between the Nazirite. And I think that we can see this positive attitude perhaps already beginning in the Torah. We know that there's actually many, many parallels between the Nazir and the Kohen. Both the Nazir and the Kohen are forbidden to drink wine. The Kohen only while he is engaged in temple worship, the Nazir all the time. Both of them have to be careful from becoming impure. And both of them, the Torah mentions specifically their hair. The Nazir has to grow his hair. The Kohen has to be careful not to grow his hair too much. And not only that, but the Nazir is actually understood to be similar, not just to any Kohen, but to a Kohen Gadol. For both of them, the psukim mention the term nezer, a crown. The Kohen Gadol is said to wear ki nezer shemen mishchat Elohav, and the Nazir ki nezer shemen Elohav al rosho. And similarly, just like the Kohen Gadol, the Nazir is also forbidden to become impure, even to the people who are closest to him, to his father and to his mother and to his brother and to his sister. So what stands behind this parallel? It seems that in Sefer Bamidbar, the Torah is proposing the option for a regular person who was not born a Kohen to try and become more pure, to take upon himself more prohibitions that will also lead him to be closer to God. And as I mentioned, it seems that during the Second Temple period, this was a very popular idea, and many Nazirim, in fact, did try to take upon themselves more sanctity more kedusha and to become closer to God in this way. Nazirut, in the eyes of the rabbis, is, and drawing on different biblical sources, is not only one thing. There's actually three different kinds of Nazirut. The first kind is what's called Nazirut Stam. A person can take a vow of Nazirut for any period. However, and a person who just says, I want to be a Nazir and doesn't specify the period, the minimum period to be a Nazir is 30 days, as Josephus also mentions. But a person can take a vow of Nazirut for, for any period that one wants, which leads us to the second category of Nazirut, which is Nazirut Olam. A person can also take a vow to be a Nazir for all of his life. And the third category, drawing on the most famous biblical Nazir, is Nazirut Shimshon. What's the difference between Nazirut Olam and Nazirut Shimshon? If a person's hair has grown so much that it becomes really heavy and cumbersome, then a Nazir Olam may cut his hair a little bit at certain intervals in order for it not to be so cumbersome. However, a Nazir Shimshon is not allowed to ever have a haircut. On the other hand, Nazir Shimshon, if he became impure to the dead, then he does not have to bring a korban. So this juxtaposition between these two categories of Nazirut again shows us that it's very difficult to determine what is the core of the Nazirut. Because if the center of the Nazirut is growing one's hair, so that's only completely true for Nazir Shimshon, who has to grow his hair extensively, but Nazir Olam is allowed to have a haircut once in a while. On the other hand, if the core of the Nazirut is not being impure to the dead, then how is it that a Nazir Shimshon, if he becomes impure, doesn't have to bring korban? So we see again and again how the different categories of the Nazirut bring us back to this problem of what exactly is the focal point and the centerpiece of being a Nazir. Let's briefly discuss the layout of the chapters in the Masechet. Chapter 1 begins with discussion which statements will be considered a vow of Nazirut, very similarly to the opening of Masechet Nedarim. Here the Masechet says, Kol kinuyei Nazirut kenazirut. So for instance, one who uses a term that's similar to Nazir, instead of saying, Ehe Nazir, I will become a Nazir, he says, Ehe Naveh. He is still considered a Nazir because the expressions are similar. This chapter also uses different statements that a person could make in order to distinguish between the different kinds of Nazirut. So for instance, one who says, I will be a Nazir from grape seeds, then he's considered a regular Nazir because any Nazir is forbidden to eat any kinds of grape products. However, one who says, I want to be like the son of Manoach, then he is considered a Nazir Shimshon because Shimshon was the son of the biblical Manoach. Chapter 2 continues this discussion of different expressions of Nazirut, but raises all kinds of complex and even strange expressions. For instance, someone who said, if this cow will say, I am Nazirah if I stand up. So what happens if a person uses all sorts of strange expressions like that in order to express their vow of Nazirut? Chapter 3 focuses on time. It discusses the period of time of the Nazirut. When does the Nazirut begin? When does Nazirut conclude? And what happens if a Nazir becomes impure or cuts his hair before the end of the period of the designated Nazirut? Chapter 4 focuses on Nazirut that is dependent upon another person. For example, a person takes a vow that he will be a Nazir on condition that another person will also be a Nazir. This chapter also is very interested in Nazirite vows of women. And in fact, both chapters 4 and chapter 5 parallel the discussion in Masechet Nedarim about Hafarat Nedarim and Hatarat Nedarim. And similarly here too, since a husband can do a hafara of the vows of his wife, what impact does that have on a woman's Naziriteship? Chapter 5 goes on to discuss what happens when the circumstances that were at the root of the Nazirut have been canceled. For example, what happens if offering, a sacrifice, which was dedicated to Nazirut was stolen? Is the Nazirut now retroactively canceled? Chapter 6 is really, in a way, the heart of the Masechet, in that it deals with the 3 prohibitions of Nazirut: the prohibition to drink wine, the prohibition to shave the hair, and the prohibition to become impure. Chapter 7 deals with the laws of impurity of the dead for the Nazir. Chapter 8 discusses Nazirites whose Nazirut is in doubt in some way, and how can they complete their vow of Naziriteship. And chapter 9 deals with the question of which kinds of people can become Nazirites. For example, non-Jews cannot become Nazirites, but slaves can become Nazirites. It also discusses children's Naziriteship, and it deals with all kinds of doubts that arise in the context of different kinds of impurities. A very, very rich Masechet. As we said, it deals with very, very diverse themes. I hope you enjoy the Masechet.